And the final part of this week's material will be based on exchange rate regimes. In other words, the framework which the country can select in order how to manage the exchange rate of its currency. Generally, there are three main types of exchange rate regimes: floating exchange rate, fixed exchange rate, and intermediate exchange rate, somewhere in between these two. So let's go through them briefly. Floating exchange rate regime is a situation, is a framework, is an arrangement when exchange rate is simply determined by demand and supply forces of the market mechanism. The government does not intervene at all. Under this exchange rate regime, the balance of payments will balance automatically. In other words, the current account will always be equal to the capital account with the opposite sign, and there will be no change in foreign reserves needed. So trade flows and capital flows will balance automatically. Under the fixed exchange rate regime, the value of a currency is fixed to a particular other currency or to a basket of some foreign currencies, and direct interventions by the central bank will be required in order to prevent any exchange rate fluctuations. Usually, a country selects this regime in order to maintain price or financial stability in the economy. This is frequently the case for highly inflationary countries which are trying to resolve this problem. They frequently fix the exchange rate regime in order to ensure price stability. Unfortunately, these regimes cannot last forever because you do need to use your reserves in order to maintain exchange rate at a particular level. And sometimes your currency can even come under attack from speculators who will try to manipulate the exchange rate to their own benefit. And in this case, the country will need to protect its exchange rate by using their reserves, by intervening in the foreign exchange markets. And of course, reserves are not limitless, and there will be some point when the foreign exchange reserves will fall to a dangerously low level, and the country will be forced to abandon its fixed exchange rate mechanism, and it will need to allow to float its exchange rate freely. Some countries do select some intermediate regimes. In other words, this is the situation when the rate is influenced by the government or central bank around a preferred exchange rate. In other words, the exchange rate fluctuates around a particular value, around a particular level. However, significant fluctuations are discouraged. And this again can take different forms. For example, an adjustable peg. This is the situation when an exchange rate is fixed for a certain period of time and then reevaluated and repegged at a new level which better suits the new macroeconomic environment, new situation in the country. It sometimes can take a form of managed or so-called dirty floating, which implies some occasional interventions by the central bank in case of extreme events in the market. Sometimes it can be a form of crawling peg, in other words, frequent readjustments of the peg, which is a form of adjustable peg mechanism. And the final version of the intermediate exchange rate regime can take a form of exchange rate band, in other words, when the lower and upper limits are set within which the exchange rate is allowed to fluctuate freely, and central bank only intervenes when exchange rate crosses this boundary, up or down. So these are different types of exchange rate regimes which can exist in the country. So generally, government intervention within the open economy is aimed at reducing short-term fluctuations of the exchange rate regime or to maintain a fixed exchange rate in case if this is what in the best interest of the country. And there will be different tools used to achieve these objectives. For example, this can be done using interventions and reserves in forex markets, or via borrowing from abroad, or through manipulating interest rates, or by implementing deflation and reflation policies, and so on. So basically, this is what you need to learn for this particular topic. Please make sure that you cover your compulsory reading, which is also stated on Moodle. And I'll talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.